Marianne Schnitger was born on August 2nd, 1870 in Germany, to medical doctor Edward Schnitger and his wife, Anna Weber. Marianne's grandfather on her mother's side, Karl, was from the prestigious Weber family, and Karl's brother was Max Weber Sr., her future husband's father. Marianne's mother died during childbirth only a few years after she was born in 1873, after which Marianne moved in with her father's mother and sister and was raised by them for the next 14 years. During this time, both her father and his two brothers went mad and were institutionalized. She endured poverty during her childhood years, and she received basic education at home. Marianne's father did not live with her and only came by for occasional visits. When Marianne turned 16, her grandfather sent her to a finishing school, from which she graduated when she was 19. After the death of her grandmother in 1889, she lived for several years with her mother's sister, and in 1891, she began to spend time with the Charlottenburg Webers, Max Jr. and his mother Helene in particular, who became like a mother to her. At the time, Max was recognized as a brilliant young scholar with a doctoral degree in law and history, and in 1893, she and Max Weber married and moved into their own apartment in Berlin. World War I was a significant impact on the Webers' lives. Germany was under the control of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and socialists, feminists, and liberals opposed him. Marianne worked to share Max's sociological life, and as Max pursued his career, he taught as a professor of economics at Freiburg University, and then as professor of political science at Heidelberg, which was the leading university in Germany. Marianne studied at the University of Freiburg, and she was among the first generation of women who succeeded in studying at university. She took an interest in feminism, and in 1896, she became the leader of a new society for the dissemination of feminist ideas. She attended political and philosophical lectures, including Max's, and the Webers were able to open Heidelberg University to women students who only came in small numbers at that time. In 1897, Max reprimanded his father for the years of abuse that he put his mother through. Before their differences were mended, his father died, and Max suffered through a deep depression, which led him to withdraw from the academic and political scene. Marianne's career was also put on hold as she worked to help Max through his mental illness. But in 1900, she did work on several publications. One was called Politics and the Women's Movement, and eventually Marianne found herself taking Max's place at political meetings. 7 years later, in 1904, Max began to get back into his scholarship, and Marianne also became more active in public life. However, Max had an affair and fell in love with their mutual friend Else Jaffe, but nevertheless their lives continued as they went on an American tour. While touring, Marianne met Jane Addams, and Marianne published several papers on women's experiences and engaged with the theories of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Her landmark work was called Marriage, Motherhood, and Law, and in the same year, 1907, Marianne's grandfather Karl died and left the couple enough money to live financially free. The Webers also started an intellectual salon, which included names such as Werner Sommart, George Simmel, and feminist Marie Baum. By 1908, Marianne had become well known in political and intellectual circles as a feminist. Some of her works were Authority and Autonomy in Marriage and Women and Objective Culture. Marianne struggled emotionally over her husband's affair, but astonishingly, the marriage remained solid and the salon continued. As time went on, World War I continued to create turmoil for Germany. Max again had become active and participated in peace negotiations, and Marianne continued to publish feminist works such as The New Woman. In 1920, Marianne became the first German woman representative elected to a state assembly. She was also elected president of the Federation of German Women's Organizations. Although there were numerous events that were taking a toll on her, she was faced with her husband's affair, the death of Helene Weber, and the suicide of Max's sister Lily, not to mention the devastation of war. Her life took a turn for the worse when Max suddenly died of pneumonia. Marianne suffered through 4 years of depression before becoming active again in society. Later, she prepared 10 volumes of Max's writings for publication, and between 1923 and 1926, she completed her most famous biography of Max Weber. She found through her writings that she was able to cope with Max's death. In 1924, she accepted an honorary doctorate from Heidelberg for her scholarship on women and the editing of Max's work. She also re-established the weekly salon. And in the waning years of the Weimar Republic, which lasted between 1919 and 1933, Marianne reached the height of her popularity as a public speaker on social and sexual ethics. She called for tolerance toward the lifestyles of individuals, but she was firmly against companionate marriage, which was a type of marriage in which the partners decide not to have children, they reserve the right to divorce with mutual consent, and where neither person has any financial or economic claim to the other. Around 1933, Marianne's public meetings came to a halt due to the politics of Hitler's regime, but she continued to hold meetings in private despite the dangers. She also published several works through an underground press. She began writing her most popular book, Women and Love, before the Nazi seizure of power, but it was published in 1935. As time went on, Marianne worried herself into a depression over the Nazi regime. She felt great anguish over her refusal to join deportations voluntarily, and during World War II, many Germans either fled or were deported from Eastern and Central Europe. However, she was not involved in any active rescue effort. When the mandatory deportation order came just a year after her 70th birthday, her two close friends took their lives. This led Marianne into a deep depression, the like of which she had never experienced before. Marianne's method of opposing the Nazi regime was more of a matter of persistence rather than resistance, where she continued publishing and upholding her worldview. After the war, Marianne continued her salon meetings until about 1952, and she died in 1954 at the age of 84. The basis of Weber's sociology was that of a woman in a patriarchal society. Germany was changing dramatically for women during the 20th century, and this deeply affected her work. She wrote about the experiences of German women of her time, many of whom were entering the workforce for the very first time. This new exposure of women to the outside world led to shifting gender-based power dynamics within the household. While women were now working outside of the home, they continued to work inside the home as well, an issue that's still present in the US today. She argued that the male-created and male-dominated institutions of law, religion, history, and the economy provide a framework for the lives of women, whose autonomy suffered as a result. She argued that the organization of society was laid out in a way that was meant to be harmonious through the bifurcated gender socialization of children, but that this socialization is patterned by patriarchy and thus subordinates women and privileges men. Her critique of patriarchy is focused on two aspects of women's experiences: marriage and work. Marianne Weber believed that the framework and structures of marriage could be used as a case study for the larger society. Her analysis begins with an understanding that, for women, the expectation of marriage was the primary matter of existence. Marriage and the destiny of women to be married was central to the lives of women and could be seen across the spectrum of law, religion, history, and economy. She acknowledged that while marriage could restrict the lives of women, it could also serve as a form of protection for women, serving to undermine the brutal power of men by contract. Weber's work, especially her major work, Marriage, Motherhood, and the Law, was devoted to the analysis of the institution of marriage. Her conclusion was that marriage is a complex and ongoing negotiation over power and intimacy, in which money, women's work, and sexuality are key issues. Another theme in her work was that women's work could be used to map and explain the construction and reproduction of the social person and the social world. Human work creates cultural products ranging from small, daily values such as cleanliness and honesty to larger, more abstract phenomena like philosophy and language. Between the two extremes lies a vast, unexplored middle territory called the middle ground of immediate daily life, in which women, being the caretakers, child rearers, and everyday economic actors of the family, have a large part. This middle ground is where the self is created, for the most part, Weber argued, and that self then affects other people in its daily actions in the world. She also felt that the continual struggle between the spiritual and the animal is what makes people human, and that rather than being a crisis to be resolved, the conflict between the natural and the moral forms the basis of human dignity. This struggle of human beings for the subordination of instinctual life under the domination of morally free human will is a cultural product, for the production of which women are largely responsible. Finally, Weber also recognized that differences such as class, education, age, and base ideologies had an enormous effect on the day-to-day existence of women. She saw that there were profound differences, not just between rural and urban women, but also among different types of rural women and different types of urban women. Urban women, of whom Weber was one, were distinguished not by their husbands' occupations, but also by their own. Within the class of working women, women's occupations, such as traditional women's work versus the elite, academics, artists, writers, etc., have an everyday effect upon patterns of daily life and lead to differences in needs, lifestyle, and overall ideologies. Weber was emphatic that leaders of women's movements not generalize from elite class experiences to advocate for only one policy or strategy for the relief of all women. She was particularly concerned by the arguments by feminist spokeswomen such as Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who argued that all women can be emancipated and fulfilled through wage sector employment. Instead, Weber argued that within capitalist employment, most wage work is done out of necessity and is hard and unfulfilling. So Weber was aware of her privileged class status, and she saw this privilege as necessitating certain responsibilities, such as speaking for women in male discourses, permeating those discourses within the interests of women, and linking objective culture to the cultural middle ground of everyday life in order to uplift the less privileged woman's life and the privileged male culture.